listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I hope you love history as much as we do, because we get to dig into more history in our series, Pilgrims, Puritans, and the Founding of New England, with Dr. MacKenzie in just a moment. Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor. You can learn more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu and Concordia University, Ann Arbor at cuaa.edu.
Live uncommon.
Joining us today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to continue our conversation on Pilgrims, Puritans, and the founding of New England. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome back.
Thank you, Andy and Sarah. I'm glad to be back with you guys.
All right, so we are now in New England. Things are happening in New England, but things are still happening back in Old England as well. Where would you like to start us off today?
Well, we're going to start off with Old England, especially as it was related to New England in the second half of the 17th century, after we get the restoration of the monarchy. Your listeners might remember that between 1640 and 1660, England experienced a cataclysmic period in which, in 1649, the king was actually beheaded. And so for 11 years, really, England could be considered a commonwealth or a republic, if you will. There was no king. There was somebody who claimed to be king, but he wasn't in England, and he wasn't ruling. This is the period of time in which the army, the parliamentary army that had been victorious over the king's army, ended up producing a strong man, military man, became basically the dictator of England in the 1650s, and that was Oliver Cromwell. What's interesting about this attempt at representative government instead of royal government is that it failed. I mean, they really tried to do it, and they tried to do it in a lot of different ways, but it didn't work. So by the time we get to 1660, you have different parts of the army in different parts of England, and the leaders of those army parts are vying with one another for control, power, etc. And so it looks really bad. Finally, one of those generals takes the lead and says, we've got to get back to normal. And so he and other leaders of the Protectorate, the Commonwealth, invite the son of Charles I to come back as their king. He does, and he is welcomed back. In 1660, the monarchy is back. Now, he had made all kinds of promises before he became king. No taxation without representation would have been a big one. Another one had to do with religion, and he had actually promised a degree of religious toleration for different forms of Orthodox Christianity. So they expected things to be different under Charles II, and they were. However, when it came to the religious establishment, Charles, promising to work through Parliament, summoned a Parliament, and the people elected a House of Commons that was dominated by Anglicans, who did not want religious toleration, not only not for the Catholics, but certainly not for those who had fought against the king and their church in the previous period. So we end up with, in England now, a religious establishment whereby the Church of England is the official religion for England, but there are thousands of clergy and 10,000s of people who aren't interested in going back to the Book of Common Prayer, bishops, and everything else that the Puritans historically had railed against. They then are illegal. Pastors are kicked out of their parishes and the like. But nobody is burned at the stake. And so you have a period of like a generation of persecution whereby non-conforming Protestants/Puritans organize their own churches, maintain themselves really, but illegally. And part of that was because Charles II, after this religious establishment by the Parliament over against basically his wishes, issued a declaration of indulgence, which basically said, we're not going to enforce these laws very fiercely. So it's a weird situation. The Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Congregationalists are all illegal, but in many places they are organizing and functioning pretty well anyway. So now what about New England? What about the colonies? Well, as soon as the Restoration was announced, the colonies sent representatives across the Atlantic hustling back to England to see what the new situation would be like. The king appointed a committee, a council, we'd call it like a colonial administrative council, that sent a letter to Massachusetts Bay in particular, telling them they'd better proclaim the king in most solemn manner, and they'd better hold themselves in readiness to answer complaints by appointing persons who were well instructed to represent New England before that committee in Old England. So they did. They sent representatives. Meanwhile, that colonial administration committee begged the king to be tolerant, to go slowly, to give Massachusetts an opportunity to be heard, to point out that although they had to submit to royal authority, there are lots of things in Massachusetts that had been done in the previous period, which were on account of the times rather than these people being intrinsically evil and so forth. So the king went along with that, and he permitted New England to retain its charter, and that charter was what had organized them as a government in the first place. It's the one that provided for the establishment of the churches, to call synods, also to have a kind of representative government, although it was still true that only church members could vote. But all that was kept in place. He did say in his letter that they were supposed to grant full liberty of worship to members of the Church of England, and they should expand the right to vote to everybody who was orthodox in his religion. But for most of Charles's reign, Massachusetts was able to evade kind of carrying those things out. What did orthodox mean and so forth? And so during most of Charles's reign, Massachusetts in particular managed to maintain itself more or less the way they had been previously. However, Massachusetts was changing, even as England was changing. And what was happening in the 17th century, second half, is that England's kind of commercial footprint around the globe on account of her merchant sailing vessels was increasing. And in that increasing, the North American colonies became critical, not just as places to which religious exiles might go, but where merchants and commercial vessels and trading posts with the interior of the continent all kind of changed the character of the colonies from being what they had been, kind of small religious outposts in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, into being much more oriented toward making money in an expanding English overseas commercial empire. And so even though they've maintained their charter, the people in the second and third generations now are not necessarily all that committed to the religious ideals of the first generation. So, in short, things are changing. At the end of Charles's reign, 1683, he issued an ultimatum to Massachusetts that they should retain their charter, but make a pledge of absolute obedience to the king, or else have their charter revoked. And who knows what would happen if they revoked their charter. Well, they had an assembly in which they debated this, and it was one of their leading pastors, a fellow whom I'm going to talk about more here in just a moment. His name was Increase Mather. Funny first name, Increase Mather, who argued against pledging absolute obedience to the king, because that would be a sin against God. God was the only one to whom one should ever give absolute obedience. So the colonists refused to take the oath, and that meant that their charter was up for grabs, and it was revoked in 1686. By that time, however, Charles was dead, and he was succeeded by his brother, James II. And I think I mentioned this in passing last time, but I'll say it again. James had surprised everybody during the middle of Charles's reign by resigning his governmental posts when a law went into effect banning Catholics from serving in the government, because it turned out that James was a Roman Catholic. There had been attempts by parliamentary leaders to pass a law prohibiting a Catholic from inheriting the throne. Charles had resisted that. It had never gone through. And so when Charles died in 1685, his brother James succeeded him as king, and James was a Catholic. I'll just mention here in passing that on his deathbed, when Charles was on his deathbed, James brought in a priest to attend his dying brother. And on his deathbed, Charles announced that he was a Catholic as well. So he died as a Catholic, even though he did not reign as a Catholic. But James was a Catholic. So now we have the reign of James. Now, you can look at James in two very radically different ways. On the one hand, he's usually portrayed, and I think most of his politically literate subjects thought of him this way, as somebody who really wanted to be an absolute monarch, like the kings of France. Louis XIV is his first cousin, so he can be portrayed in that fashion. But he also can be portrayed as a champion of religious liberty. I told you that during the reign of Charles, in practical terms, there was a lot of religious liberty. That had been true also under Oliver Cromwell. And now James trying to make it official by publishing a declaration of indulgence in which he announced that he was not going to enforce any of the laws against the Catholics or any of the nonconformists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians. And actually, he did a couple of these. And the second one was written for him by William Penn, who was, William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, and also was a Quaker and a strong believer in religious liberty. Well, at any rate, so that's the policy of James, but he is a Roman Catholic. He appoints Roman Catholics to the government. He appoints Roman Catholics to the colleges, universities. Everybody thinks he's just going to turn England back into a Catholic country. And then when his young wife he's in his 50s, but his young wife bears him a child and turns out to be a boy, and that means the boy will be raised as a Catholic and will succeed his father as king. The leading Protestants in the Church of England and in politics decide we can't run the risk of somebody who wants to rule like Louis XIV, and in perpetuity we'll have such monarchs who are Catholics. We've got to go elsewhere, and so they stage a revolution. But before we do the revolution, I want to go back to the colonies, because the time of James is challenging there as well.
And let's pause right there and come back to the colonies after we take a quick break. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Golseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason: to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Welcome back to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Golseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
We're talking with the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we are going back to the colonies, and there's been some drama in Old England. So what's happening in New England with all of the things that are happening in Old England? How is that affecting the colonies?
Yeah. In spite of the fact that if we're looking at William Penn, James II is a champion of religious liberty, most of the folks in New England didn't think that way. In 1686, the charter for Massachusetts Bay was canceled, and even worse, James reorganized the North American colonies and put Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, Rhode Island into one colony called the Dominion of New England. And then just to punctuate that a little more firmly, a couple years later, 1688, he added New York and New Jersey to the Dominion of New England, Dominion of New England. It did not have an elected legislature the way Massachusetts had before. He appointed a royal governor, a fellow by the name of Edmund Andros. And Andros had formerly been a royal governor of New York, but now he's governor of the entire Dominion. Very loyal to James II and his family. Had very little sympathy for the New Englanders. He did have a council of people presumably representing the Dominion, but they were all people that he appointed. So he didn't necessarily have people who were representative of the population of any of those colonies, including Massachusetts Bay. He was firm in terms of establishing the king's prerogative there, and that meant, for example, enforcing the Navigation Acts. Not really worried too much about that from the religious standpoint, but the Navigation Acts were an attempt to control the commerce of the colonies in the interest of the mother country by indicating to the colonies with what nations they could trade and how they were supposed to do it, so that, again, the mother country would be benefited rather than... So that was an aggravation, certainly. And then he also, on the question of religion, he took steps to authorize the establishment of Church of England in Massachusetts, as well as getting them to recognize other religions there as well. So it really cutting against the grain of traditional Puritanism, which really enjoyed a religious monopoly in New England prior to the reign of James and Edmund Andros. Well, this didn't last long. As I said, only 3 years in England, largely because of James's pro-Catholic policy. He's replaced, and when he's replaced in Old England, he's replaced in New England as well. Accordingly, Andros is out. He's actually, I'm not sure whether I want to call them rebels, but the people of the elite of Massachusetts end up putting Andros in prison, where he awaits final adjudication. And then they immediately send Increase Mather back to Old England to see if they can't get their charter back under which they had operated in the 17th century. Now, turns out they can't. They get a new charter, and the new charter, 1691, the new charter now puts into law that principle of religious liberty that we talked about before. It's religious liberty basically for Trinitarian Protestants. There's no religious liberty for Unitarians. There's no religious liberty for Catholics. But nonetheless, Baptists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, all will have religious liberty under this new charter. Now, there's more to say about what happens next, but at this point, I want to say a little bit more about that Increase Mather. He's one of the principal ecclesiastical leaders at this time. So let me talk to you a little bit about him. Increase gets his name on account of his parents' wish to commemorate the increase that with which God had blessed their church and colonial efforts. So Puritans like to give their children names like prudence or piety or faith, names that often suggested theological truths. And that was Increase also. This was the increase that God had supplied to the people of New England over the years of their founding. Now, Increase's father was Richard Mather. He's one of the founding pastors of New England. And Increase was brought up to be a pastor. So that meant he had to get educated. And already, well, I should give you the date of his birth. It's 1639, so he's pretty close to the founding of the colony. When he's 12 years old, they want to send him to school. Now, where are they going to send him to school? Well, by that time, Harvard College, now university, had already been founded. And so off he went. And there he was at the age of 12. And he received his bachelor's degree at the age of 17. He's preparing for the ministry. And so when he turned 18, he actually preached his first sermon in a village near his home, and then subsequently his second sermon in his father's church. However, he's not going to stay in New England. His parents want him to get an even better education than he had at Harvard, so they sent him back to the old world, and he went to Dublin. Dublin, of course, was part of Ireland, ruled by the King of England. And they had and still have a significant institution of higher learning, Trinity College. And there he took his master's degree in just after 1 year of studying. At the time of his graduation, in good Puritan fashion, he refused to wear a cap and gown. But nonetheless, the scholars were still impressed by him, and they wanted him to stay there and join the faculty. But no, he decided to take a pastoral post, but not in New England. He became a pastor on one of the Channel Islands, the islands off the coast of England in the English Channel between England and France. He took a pastoral post in one of those and was there when, I should have given you a few dates. He's there at the tail end of Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth. So he's there in 1660 when Charles II now becomes king. When that news was announced, Increase Mather refused to drink to the new king's health, refused to sign papers expressing joy at the restoration of the monarchy. And so, not too surprisingly, very shortly thereafter, he came back to New England. He came back to New England, took up a post at one of the city churches in Boston, and remained in that post until his death several years later in 1723. Now, he becomes pastor of an important church. He becomes an important voice for the Puritan, the old-fashioned Puritans who are trying to hang on to the religious establishment of the founders from his post at Boston's North Church. He's the one who had opposed giving an absolute pledge of loyalty to the king. And in 1688, when the Glorious Revolution occurred and James II was out and William and Mary had come in and replaced them, the colonists sent Increase back to England, and he was active in getting them to replace Edmund Andros, and he was there lobbying for the restoration of their original charter, but he couldn't get it. He got the one in 1691. Got a few more things to say about his son, but maybe we ought to pause here and do that next time.
That's true. We can save that for next time. We had so much history packed into this time. I'm looking forward to next time as well. And do we get to Salem next time as well?
I think we will, yes.
All right. The Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks for helping us learn about Pilgrims, Puritans, and the founding of New England today.
Well, you're very welcome. Glad to do it.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.